start, I'd like to pay my respects to the Sammasambuddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I always found this use of like Buddhist psychology, like very interesting, because psych came from soul, right? And we're like, no soul, anatta, anatman. So like, it kind of doesn't fit right if we take it literally. We're not studying the psyche because we're not studying the soul. But, nowadays we use it differently. Anyways, I think, to me, this has been a very important topic for our time. Not in the sense of like, oh, there's something special that I'm going to share with you that you don't know, or there's something that hasn't been shared with you before in the past that's in the Buddhist Suttas, in the early Pali Canon. But I think this topic is very important just because of how Buddhism is talked about, portrayed, and used in our current context. There's a lot of Buddhist psychologizing, Buddhism and therapy, Buddhist counseling, mindfulness too. Sometimes mindfulness is just a more comfortable term that we can use instead of saying Buddhist and then mindfulness, psychology, or whatever. So I think it's important that we kind of have some just basic understanding of the foundations of the study of the mind, according to the early suttas, early Buddhism. So here's a little overview of the topics we're going to be covering, and don't worry, there's only one slide for each topic. So like we're not going to do a lot of PowerPoint. I know some people are tired of it, especially these last 3 years being on Zoom, right? Because of the pandemic and doing everything on Zoom, and so I'm just trying to keep it very simple here. So there's 4 things that I think are very important to get a very elementary understanding of Buddhist psychology from the early Buddhist text. And these are not original ideas. Actually, I'm sharing and building upon and giving my interpretation of great scholars like Padmasiri De Silva from Sri Lanka, and my teacher, Dr. Bhante Punnaji. So I'm very influenced by these 2 people. And if you're familiar with them, you're gonna see a lot of that here. So this is no particular order. They're just 4 important things. It's not like the most important one first and the least important, but just 4 things that we should keep in mind. One is that, Buddhist psychology is mainly directed at the question of human suffering. Dukkha, 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 right? That's all we hear all the time when we come to Buddhism. Dukkha, suffering, birth, sickness, old age, and death. Not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, and losing what you hold very dear. And we see the Buddha as a therapist, psychologist, counselor, whatever we want to call him, really addressing this issue in these one-on-one conversations that he has with people. Trying to help them find complete freedom from dukkha, or at least lessening their dukkha, their suffering. So the purpose of Buddhist psychology is really to alleviate and ultimately eliminate all suffering. Another important foundation of Buddhist psychology is that the mechanics of it. How does it work? Is it spontaneous? Is it like the Buddha? Is the Buddha controlling your mind, or is your mind completely random? Is there no order to what's happening in your mind? Well, according to the early Buddhist texts, the mind or psychological states are conditioned, right? So a unwholesome thought leads to an unwholesome thought. A wholesome thought leads to a wholesome thought. A greedy thought leads to a greedy thought. A thought of renunciation leads to a thought of renunciation. An angry thought doesn't lead to a thought of loving kindness. And you might know this kind of conditionality dependent origination as idappaccayatā, specific conditionality, or paṭiccasamuppāda, dependent origination. So the mind works in a conditioned causal way, what we call emotions, sensations, perceptions, consciousness, feeling, all these phenomena that are experienced arise due to the presence of the necessary conditions, one leading to another. So the mind is just not random. It's not chaos. It's not predetermined by some outside force, like the Buddha or some God. Another important foundation of Buddhist psychology is that it is concerned on the ethical and moral dimension of thoughts. All thoughts have a moral or ethical value or valence to them. That's very important to understand, because this has a direct connection to what one will experience in the future. If someone thinks an unwholesome thought or speaks in an unwholesome way or acts in an unwholesome way, then suffering follows that, as we get in the first verse of the Dhammapada. But if one thinks in a skillful way, in a wholesome way, then happiness follows that. Every thought that you have, every emotion, every feeling has a value to it. It matters. It counts. Buddhist ethics is not only concerned with the external domain of our speech and our actions, physical actions, but every single thought that we entertain, that we cultivate, that we generate intentionally matters in a cosmic level, right? Your thought affects the universe. Your thought affects reality. Another important foundation of Buddhist psychology is that the mind is not an entity. Sometimes we think of the mind as a solid thing. The mind is a thing, and of its by itself. But the Buddha divides the mind into several different aggregates or activities or different processes. And we'll get into detail about these different things, these different activities or functions that we kind of stick into this concept of when we talk in English, the mind. It's not one thing. It's not just one entity, like a soul or how we use consciousness in the West. It's not a thing, but something that consists of many different things. Okay. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the Four Noble Truths, right? There's not going to be anything new here. So Buddha is really trying to address human suffering, right? And what is human suffering, as I said earlier, right? Dissatisfaction, that birth, aging, sickness, death, associating with the unpleasant, a disassociation with the pleasant, and not getting what you want. This is the problem. This is the disease. This is what the Buddha is concerned with. And not only for humans, but with all beings, but particularly speaking to humans. He gives a great emphasis on how rare it is to be born a human, and to be born a human during the time where there is Dhamma available. So the Buddha is really focusing on this. The Buddha didn't really focus on trying to create a utopian society or other things like that. He was really trying to address this one problem of dukkha, and specifically with human beings, although he did also work with devas, celestial beings, but he didn't really work with hell beings or animals and help them try to get out of their dukkha, because it's very difficult for them to be able to understand and even practice if they did understand, because they just live in such difficult conditions that it's not very accessible for them to practice this. So what is the source of this human suffering that the Buddha is trying to help us eliminate? That is tanha, literally thirst. It's an urge, a longing, a craving for sensual pleasures all the time, for existence, immortality, and for non-existence, which means here like an aversion towards existence. But here's the good news. The Buddha brings good news. The prognosis is good, which is happiness. The cessation of suffering, which means the elimination of craving. The Buddha said, Nibbana paramam sukham. Nirvana is the highest happiness, right? So Buddhist psychology is really radical in the sense that it proposes that you can be supremely happy, ultimate happiness, transcendental happiness, not just a, Thai iced tea happiness or going to the Bahamas happiness or something like that, A real, long-lasting, imperturbable happiness, akuppaccayatā vimutti. A happiness that is not fazed by external conditions. A happiness that is independent of conditions, the unconditioned. You can always be happy. That is the point of Buddhist psychology, to help humans be free from suffering and be supremely happy. How do we get there? Oh, by practicing this modality, this conglomeration of many interventions, of 8 interventions or 8 different kind of practices called the Noble Eightfold Path. Magga. Ariyo Atangiko Maggo, the Noble Eightfold Path. Basically, Buddhism is oriented in a therapeutic model, meaning healing, right? If we look at the etymology of therapy, it means to heal. So Buddhist psychology is really there to heal. It's a dedicated and directed towards healing, making whole. Again, that's why the Buddha uses samma. Samma means complete, whole. Samma ditti, samma sankappa, samma vacca, samma kamanta, samma jivas, samma vayama, samma sati, samma samadhi. The samma sambuddha, samma, wholeness, completeness. To completely heal you, so there's no gaps. As I said earlier, Buddhist psychology proposes that all mental events are conditioned, that everything arises due to the presence of the necessary conditions. Everything depends on conditions. Since it depends on conditions, it is subject to termination. So we don't have to be stuck in unwholesome states, in sad states, in fearful states, in angry states. You don't have to be stuck with the person that you think you are now, the personality, the character, the mental patterns, the emotions, the thoughts. Since things are conditioned, there's hope because we can change the conditions. We can manipulate the conditions. We can intervene in this process. If it was random, there would be no hope. If it was completely deterministic, we'd have to ask the Buddha or God to change our mind for us. But it's through understanding conditionality that we can create and generate and cultivate and develop the necessary conditions to be free. Oh, not finished yet. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. That's what is conditionality. If in case I didn't make it clear, because I kept talking about conditionality, but I never defined it. That's what I mean by conditionality. Everything is constructed. Everything constructed depends on conditions. Because it depends on conditions, it is transitory, right? Our mood, our temperament, our thought patterns, our emotions, our feelings are transitory. Because it is transitory, it is unsatisfactory, even the pleasant ones, the pleasurable ones. Because it is neither permanent nor satisfactory, nor does it deserve to be personalized. Me, mine, myself, part of me. That which is transitory and that which is transitory is unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory. The Buddha famously said, "Sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe dhamma anatta." All constructed things are transitory. All constructed things are unsatisfactory. And all dhammas, all phenomena, all mental states, all experiences are empty of a self. So we talk about the mind in Buddhism, but what is the mind in Buddhism? Well, it isn't a thing. That would be reifying it, which the Buddha always tells us not to do. We shouldn't reify things. We can divide the mind in many ways. One useful way to think about the mind is through the paṭiccasamuppāda, the 5 aggregates. Another useful way to think about the mind, which I haven't noticed to be emphasized enough, and that's why I'm going to emphasize today, because I find it as an alternative or parallel way to think about it, is 3 activities known as vijnana, citta, and mano. The term vijnana refers to sensory perception, including mano vijnana, which is the mind, the thinking part, the intellect. It's considered the 6th of the 6 senses, salayatana, the 6 sensorial mediums. So this ability to cognize, aware of sensory perception, sensory mediums, is one activity of the mind. It's one thing within this thing that we call mind in Buddhist psychology. Vijnana is to be comprehended, the Buddha said. Another function of the mind, activity of the mind, is citta, which refers to the emotional or affective system. Here we're talking about fear, anxiety, frustration, sadness, sensuality, greed, joy, all these things. Citta is to be calmed. The citta is to be unified, made whole, made wholesome, to be made harmonious. So when we focus on samatha practice, when we focus on cultivating samadhi, we're really focusing on calming the citta, tranquilizing the citta. When we talk about the pancha nivarana, the 5 hindrances, these 5 hindrances are unskillful states of citta. And the third activity is the one mano, refers to the cognitive and conceptual activities. Like in the Dhammapada, mano pupangamma dhamma manosetta manomaya, right? The mind is the forerunner of all things, or thinking is the forerunner of all things. All things are made out of thought, of thinking. If one thinks in an unwholesome way, then suffering follows them. Just like the wheels of a cart that follow the ox that it's tied to. And when we look at the salayatana, the 6 senses, where we talk about mano, it says that mano is the one that creates the thoughts. And mano vijnana is the perception, the awareness of thoughts once they arise. And the Buddha says that the purpose of mano is to understand reality, to understand these 3 realities. The intellect, our conceptual cognitive abilities, help us understand anicca, impermanence, help us understand suffering, unsatisfactoriness, and help us understand non-self, or the impersonal nature of all experiences, of all phenomena, of all activities.